Good evening, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Abigail Seidner. I'm the Executive Director of the Birnbaum Women's Leadership Network at NYU School of Law. And on behalf of the BWLN and our co-hosts for tonight's event, the Ms. Foundation for Women and the Georgetown Law Center on Poverty and Inequalities Initiative on Gender Justice and Opportunity, I'd like to welcome and thank you for joining us for tonight. Our event tonight is the Fight for Gender Justice Part 3, the Next Generation of Gender Justice, which is the final installment of our speaker series with the Ms. Foundation this year. And we are so excited to be here. Before we begin, a few logistics. First, automatic captioning is available for this event. So to access the captioning, please click on live captioning at the bottom of your screen. And if you have questions for our panelists, you can submit them using the Q&A box. Feel free to submit them throughout the evening and we will get to as many as we can. So I'm now so pleased to introduce our welcome speakers, Aaliyah Horton and Manzili Kokai, two of the Georgetown Initiative's youth advisors, to continue tonight's remarks. So Aaliyah is a third-year student at The Ohio State University, where she studies political science and philosophy. She is dedicated to advocating on behalf of girls and young women of color and helping to create a changed world where young ladies of color can feel comfortable and have a safe space to be their authentic selves. She has been a youth advisor to the Trauma Informed Schools Learning Network for Girls of Color since 2019. Manzili Kokai is a chemist, journalist, and activist. She is currently finishing a Bachelor's of Science in Chemistry and plans to do research in sustainability. She has been a youth advisor to the Trauma Informed Schools Learning Network since 2020, where she advocates for girls and gender expansive youth of color. With that, I will turn it over to them to get us started. Thanks for being here.
Hello, everyone. I'm so glad to be joining today and adding a youth voice to this conversation. I'm a youth advisor to the Trauma Informed Schools Learning Network for Girls of Color, which was founded by Georgetown Law's Initiative on Gender Justice and Opportunity and is co-led with the National Black Women's Justice Institute. Our Youth Advisory Committee works to advocate for the needs of girls and gender expansive youth of color in schools. We are in the process of creating the Bill of Rights to support the mental health of girls of color in schools, aiming to expand the rights of marginalized students. I think of modern oppression as a dragon, and activists as warriors trying to defeat it. Gender justice to me is one of our sharpest weapons in the struggle against oppression. It's the foundation for all other freedoms. While adult allies are important to the fight for justice for girls, it's even more important that adult allies work to uplift our voices on this topic. That's why I am honored to be here alongside leaders who are also working towards a better tomorrow. I will now turn it over to my colleague, Aaliyah, to introduce our first speaker.
Thank you, Manzili. Hi, everyone. I'm Aaliyah. I serve as a youth advisor to the Learning Network for Girls of Color, along with Manzili. I am proud to introduce Dr. Monique W. Morris, who is an award-winning author and social justice scholar with 3 decades of experience in the areas of education, civil rights, juvenile, and criminal justice. Dr. Morris is the president and CEO of Grant Makers for Girls of Color, the nation's only philanthropic intermediary that explicitly focuses on resourcing movements and organizations led by and in support of cis and trans girls and films of color. Dr. Morris is the author of 2 books that are coming out soon: Cultivating Joyful Learning, Spaces for Black Girls, Insights into Interrupting School Pushout, and Charisma Turn, a graphic novel about supporting Black girls. She is an executive producer and co-writer of the film documentary, Push Out, The Criminalization of Black Girls in Schools, which is based on her book of the same name, as well as Sing a Rhythm, Dance a Blues, Education for Liberation of Black and Brown Girls. Her 2018 TED Talk on how to stop the criminalization of Black girls in schools have been viewed nearly 2 million times and is translated into 20 different languages. She is also a longtime partner of the Georgetown Law Initiative on Gender Justice and Opportunity, where I am an advisor. It is an honor to see Dr. Morris expand her advocacy for girls of color When I was 12, she gave me the courage and platform to speak up for myself in a room full of adults, decision makers, in an event that encouraged me to begin to advocate for Black girls. And I would like to personally thank her for being a vessel for the voices of Black girls. Thank you.
Good evening. What great fortune I have to provide introductory remarks for this remarkable collection of passion and commitment to gender justice. My name is Dr. Monique Morris, and I serve as President and CEO of Grantmakers for Girls of Color, or as we're known, G4GC. At G4GC, we work to mobilize philanthropic and other investments toward organizations and movements that are led by and center girls and femmes of color. We have more than 200 grantee partners spread across every state, Washington, D.C., Guam, and Puerto Rico. It's work that places us in community with cis, trans, and gender fluid women, girls, and femmes who identify as Black, Indigenous, Native, Latina, Asian, Arab, Pacific Islander, and other people of color who are leading the fight for gender justice at its intersections each day. I work from an operational definition of justice that's rooted in the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., who said that justice is power correcting everything that stands against love. That means that it's our duty to engage the tools we have available to us to rally power, to disrupt and correct the politics, policies, and practices of fear that immobilize people as a function of their gender identity. We're learning that the fluid and dynamic nature of gender identity sometimes leads those fighting for equity to feel disenfranchised by those who are supposed to be in support of their journey. This is only possible when we fail to engage intersectional frameworks that invite people who are at the center of our work to be co-constructors of that work. In my mind, the next iteration of this fight for gender justice is to maintain a praxis of reciprocity. Reciprocity is understood as the mutual exchange of influence, actions, and resources and privileges. And a praxis is a practice or custom informed by theory. Beyond a theoretical engagement, though, operationalizing the notion that those at the center of an inquiry are most immediately impacted by an issue have the wisdom and capacity to actively inform strategies. So when we combine these two as reciprocity as praxis, as we're doing here at G4GC, then it becomes the implementation of the belief that we all benefit from the investments in organizations most historically marginalized by philanthropy and other movements, and that making these deep investments in these organizations generates transformative outcomes for girls, femmes, and gender expansive youth in our communities who identify as Black, Indigenous, Native, Latina, Asian, Arab, Pacific Islander, and other people of color in the United States and beyond. These healthy communities then create new directions for our work in support of just, equitable, and in my work in and outside of G4GC, the liberated futures of girls of color. To me, the invitation is for us to deepen our resolve to engage participatory methods that expand our understanding and strategies for resourcing and advocating for justice, such that they're not weaponized to benefit only those with proximity to power, but to reimagine what power looks like and what it especially looks like in service to young women and girls who have been historically marginalized by social movements designed to elevate gender justice. So it means that we understand that we're not doing gender justice work if we're not also engaged in movements associated with young people. For example, climate justice is a girls of color issue. The campaign for police-free schools is also a girls of color issue, and we must articulate them as such. We're not doing gender justice work if we're not also engaged in movements associated with racial justice, disability justice, justice associated with sexuality and linguistic diversity, and so on. That is our challenge, but also our blessing, because from it will emerge the new ways of being that we seek and that we demand. Thank you for these few moments to offer these thoughts, and I wish you well with the panel discussion.
Hi. So I want to thank Dr. Morris for giving us those remarks. Next, we will be turning over to Sabrina Bernadelle. Sabrina Bernadette is an Equal Justice Works Fellow for the Education Team at the National Women's Law Center, where she leads federal and state advocacy efforts on ending school pushout for girls of color, especially when caused by exclusionary discipline and school policing. Before joining WLC, Sabrina has advocated for access to education for underrepresented students at Advocates for Children of New York, Advancement Project, and the U.S. Department of Education Office for Civil Rights.
Sabrina holds a JD from the Georgetown University Law Center, where she found joy in serving as the president of the Georgetown Women of Color Collective. As a first-generation Haitian American, Sabrina grew up relying on spaces and mentors in schools to help her explore her identity as a woman of color. Today, she is dedicated to the educational equity work as a means of keeping schools safe for girls of color as they come into their own. May we all please welcome Sabrina.
Thanks so much, Aaliyah and Manzili, for the wonderful introduction. And once again, to all of you, welcome to this panel, which is the fight for gender justice, the next generation of gender justice. And as the title foreshadows, this panel will focus on next generation leaders and look ahead to the future of gender justice work, ranging from the rights of girls of color to emerging issues for LGBTQI plus youth and students. The panel will also explore how various advocates are laying the groundwork for long-term change. Now, with that, I will introduce our esteemed panelists who will be graciously offering their time and expertise on tonight's panel. So first, we have Shonda Chapman, Director of the Girls Fund Initiative at the Ms. Foundation for Women. We also are joined by Courtney Dankworth, partner at Debevoise and Plimpton. We're also joined tonight by Rebecca Epstein, class of 95, Executive Director at the Center on Poverty and Inequality at Georgetown Law, as well as Nadra Niddle, Education Reporter at the 19th. Welcome, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. All right, we can kick us off. So the first question I'm going to direct first to Shonda and then open up to some other panelists will be, what societal issues are we seeing girls engage with, and how are they showing up as leaders? Shonda, would you like to go first?
I'd love that. Good evening, everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you. Thank you to our organizers at NYU for the thought and intentionality behind these discussions. Thank you to my co-panelists, fabulous as they are. And thank you to those fantastic youth who brought us into the space. So I'll talk a little bit about sort of the what we do, the how we do, and the ways that that's informed by the issues that we see girls engage with. And I'll turn it over to my colleagues who work more directly with girls. But before I jump in, I always think it's important to start with my own positionality. So in addition to my work, you should know that I'm someone who identifies as a Black American, as a queer person. I also identify as a mother. In fact, there are two unruly little people here who I believe their greatest joy in life is to interrupt their mommy while she talks to people live on the internet. So that's what happened. I come to this work from movement work, and my background is in research and policy. And I'm someone who was directly impacted by many systems. So as a youth, so this work is really deeply important and personal to me. So the Girls of Color Initiative is a national initiative. It provides resources and support of the advocacy and the movement building of girls of color. At the Ms. Foundation, we envision a world where the power and the possibilities of girls of color aren't limited by any identity. We know that girls of color are the experts of their own experiences, and we know that with the right opportunities, they have the abilities, the ideas, and the passion to write their own stories, to create their own futures, and to drive change in their own communities and the world. At the same time, we know that cisgender, transgender, and queer girls of color live at the intersection of multiple systems of oppression, and that includes white supremacy, patriarchy, colonization, and unchecked capitalism. We know that girls of color face tremendous social and structural barriers, and that includes really disturbing patterns of policing, interpersonal violence and institutional violence in their schools and communities. And if that weren't enough, we know that they face significant barriers to educational achievement, economic and political equality, all this while being the recipients of deeply embedded racial and gender biases in the media, in public policy, philanthropy, research, and so forth. But more important, I think, to share is that girls of color are ready to lead. In fact, they are leading, and they always have been. And we'll do it. They'll do it whether we resource them or not. So we see it as our job to really get out of the way and make sure that they're fully resourced to do so, and to make sure that the organizations that support them in their communities are fully resourced to do so, and to give them the tools that they need to create the future that they want and they deserve. At MIS, we do that in a couple of ways. First, we work to shift power back to them to create change. We move resources to support girls and the organizations that support them. And then we leverage our own institutional capital to influence the field in support of girls of color and the organizations to support them. And that's just the what we do. I think it's just important to talk about the how we do. And first, our work is deeply rooted in an intersectional feminist framework. And we are guided by the principles of healing justice. And what that means is that we believe that people of color, that youth of color, sort of deserve to heal from generational violence and trauma. And it's the idea that we all deserve to heal on our own terms and to confront oppressive systems that impact our lives. Our work is inclusive across a broad range of identities. And through our conversations directly with youth, we know that many of the youth that we hope to support don't identify with the term girl. So therefore, our work strives to be inclusive around gender, especially. We have an unflinching commitment to building power because we know that lasting and sustainable change really requires sort of fundamental changes that reposition them in relationship to power, and allows them to shape institutions that impact their lives and not just have those institutions impact them. And lastly, we celebrate joyful resistance because we recognize that for girls of color who live in a world that is often hostile to their very existence, joy isn't just a goal, it's a powerful survival strategy and active resistance in and of itself. So we prioritize strategies that boldly and unapologetically name joy as a central element. So with that, I'll turn it over back to Sabrina and allow some of our colleagues to talk about the work they do sort of very directly with girls.
Thanks so much for that insightful background, Shonda, and to give us more information on the work you all do at the Ms. Foundation for Women. I'd like to turn it to Rebecca to hear a little bit more about some engagement with various youth partners.
Sure, and I too appreciate you, Shonda, for setting the context for all of this. I feel like I'm gonna narrow this down in a way that sort of makes something concrete out of the poetry that you just created. But when I hear the question about what issues girls engage with, I'm hearing the question of what matters most to girls. And what we're hearing from girls is the most urgent and pressing issues to them. And what I would want to say first and foremost that we hear from girls is that they want to engage in the mental health crisis that is ongoing in this country and is not being met by the supports that it should be. And our advisors tell us that in particular in schools, which is where they spend the most of their time, not only are schools not providing the mental health care services that they need to, but they're also not creating a climate in which they can focus and learn. They need to be structuring school differently to be not only trauma informed, but also to change the culture from punitive to healing, and most importantly, to give girls space to build community, because we do know that it's unique to girls that relationships are foundational to their development and their mental health. And so we need schools to do better in connecting girls to one another and to trusted adults in schools as part of that mental health strategy. Manzili, I think, mentioned that our advisors are in the middle of crafting a bill of mental health rights for girls of color in schools. And it's been really inspiring to see them work on it. When we first threw the question open to our advisors about what they think this Bill of Rights should address, there were so many questions. We did a jam board where all the girls were putting up Post-it notes, and it was chock full right away. So that points to the level of problem and barriers, but it also points to how girls are ready with the answers. And as Shonda said, they're leaders by showing up and expressing themselves. And our job is to listen to them and to bring them to the table. I often find it a little surprising that in conversations about girls, a lot of folks don't think to bring girls in. And I just think, would you have a conversation about anti-Semitism without inviting Jews to give their perspective? It doesn't make any sense. And I think there is this bias against youth having anything valuable to say or being able to craft policy solutions. And that's absolutely wrong. So that would be my topmost priority that I've heard from girls.
Thank you for that, Rebecca. Yeah, I think it's extremely important that we talk about how schools are responding, as well as this issue of mental health that, they go hand in hand, as you mentioned. I appreciate your highlighting that. I'd also like to toss it over to Nadra to talk a little bit more about maybe some of the student activism that you've heard in your work.
Sure. Thank you so much for having me. My name is Nadra Niddle, and I'm an education reporter for the 19th News, which is an organization that focuses on the intersection of gender and public policy. And I've had the opportunity to interview several girls during my time at the 19th. And I would also echo what Rebecca said, in the sense that mental health is a top priority for girls. I've interviewed students about the pandemic and how during the pandemic, though we've heard a lot of news stories about how the pandemic worsened mental health, there's also a subset of youth for various reasons that found the time of remote learning to be one in which they could kind of catch their breath, in a sense where, they felt that they were being less scheduled, or less, I would say, over scheduled, and they had time to concentrate on other things besides, school and extracurricular activities. So now that school is back, some students who maybe didn't have mental health problems seem to be developing them, because they feel like they weren't given, a time to really transition. In some ways, they felt like they went from 0 to 100 in terms of being back in school full time and dealing with the pressures, of school. So especially, I would say older students, maybe more so than younger students. I've interviewed students about issues like dress codes and gender disparities in dress codes, and how girls are, especially girls of color, tend to be disproportionately targeted by school dress codes. And some girls, they've reached out to organizations like the ACLU about, pursuing cases against their school districts. So that's happened. I would also say COVID. We had students in New York, Boston, Chicago, Oakland earlier this year walk out of classes to protest conditions they felt were unsafe for themselves, for students, and other staff. And I've interviewed college students as well about sexual assault and changes during the Trump administration that made it more difficult for students to report sexual assault, or put students in situations where the alleged perpetrators were allowed to essentially have more power during that process in a way that would make students less likely to come forward. And also, I've talked to students about LGBTQ issues and some of the discrimination that they faced from their schools because of that. And as well as just even some family conflict that they've dealt with because of that as well. So those are some of the main issues. I would also just quickly throw in issues like climate change, school discipline, and food insecurity as issues that are all affecting girls and that girls are engaging in activism about.
Thanks for sharing your experiences, Nadra, and the student stories you've heard. I think it leads, it's a good segue into our second question about what barriers are we seeing girls struggle with specifically. You mentioned a few, and we want to also maybe highlight what barriers are particular to Black girls specifically, and other girls of color, similar to what Dr. Morris had mentioned in her opening remarks. Rebecca, I'm going to turn it over to you to maybe talk through some of those barriers that we see in schools and the courts.
Sure. One of the things that we've looked at in terms of barriers for Black girls across systems is adultification bias. So we came out with research in 2017 that was designed by Dr. Jamelia Blake of Texas A&M University, where we surveyed adults across the country to measure whether they view Black girls and white girls differently in terms of their perception of how innocent they are and how adult-like they are. And Dr. Blake split the survey up into 4 age brackets. And the results were really startling because not only did they show a clear discrepancy in how adults view Black girls in viewing them as less innocent and more like adults, but that difference in perception spanned across girls' lives, their girlhood. So the difference in perception between Black and white girls peaked in the age group of 10 to 14 years old, right in middle school when you're forming your sense of self and what the world expects of you and what you expect of the world. And it went back to the age group of 5 to 9 years old. It persisted in high school as well. But we were really struck to see that such young children who you could argue could not be viewed as anything but innocent might actually be viewed that way by many adults. Thinking of a teacher approaching 2 kindergartners, a Black girl and a white girl, and viewing the Black girl as somehow less innocent is startling and shocking. And the implications of this for Black girls are huge. So you mentioned schools, and it seems clear that by viewing Black girls as less innocent, teachers are more likely to discipline them, to not give them that second chance, to not believe them. One of our participants in a focus group said that a Black girl's tears aren't as valued as a white girl's tears. And in reflection of this, in fact, Black girls experience greater discipline wildly out of proportion to their enrollment across all categories of discipline, whether that's arrest or restraint, suspension, or expulsion. And it has clear implications in the juvenile justice system as well, in the same way, where we also see that same pattern of Black girls being treated more punitively across all decision-making points in the system.
Thank you, Rebecca. And I think, this is a great place to highlight that a lot of these barriers contribute to what is known as, the school to prison pipeline, for example, the phenomenon of girls and other students being pushed out of school and into these criminal systems. I want to turn it over to Shonda maybe to talk a little bit more about part of this pipeline and even expanding it a bit to talk a little more about the sexual abuse to prison pipeline and other issues that you may have seen in your work.
Actually, you know what I think that sort of because Rebecca and her team work specifically on the sexual abuse to prison pipeline work, I'd actually, if you don't mind, I'll send it back to Rebecca, just sort of to uplift that work. And then I'll come back in and we'll talk a little bit more.
Absolutely.
Thanks, Shonda, and it's thanks to the Ms. Foundation that we did this work at all. This report was released in 2015 with the Ms. Foundation as a co-author, but I stuck around, so I am placed to talk about it. What we examined in that report is the phenomenon in which when girls, especially girls of color, experience sexual violence, instead of being treated as survivors and supported, they're criminalized. And one of the most egregious examples of that are survivors of child sex trafficking who are sent into the system on various criminal charges instead of being treated as the survivors that they are. In the case of sexual abuse, girls are really harmed across race lines, but I would want to emphasize that once again, the amplifying effect of structural racism on top of gender inequities means that girls of color are most often disproportionately harmed. Shonda, I want to throw it back to you.
Thank you, Rebecca. I am familiar with some research that was conducted by Black Women's Blueprint, an organization that works to end violence against Black women and girls. And they found that 6 of every 10 Black girls under the age of 18 had experienced some sort of coercive form of sexual violence in their life. So 6 out of every 10 Black girls they found were experiencing this. And the research suggests that that is greatly underreported. Over the course of my own life, and very specific to my own life, I've talked about it in my advocacy about the ways experiencing violence, experiencing sexual violence, sort of pushed me as a youth into the juvenile justice system, and the ways in which the folks that were charged with protecting me didn't really see me as a kid and criminalized me. So, it's certainly cathartic and healing to be doing the sorts of work that supports youth and hopefully sort of eradicates this sort of violence. I can also tell you that we hardly understand the full scope of violence, physical, sexual, mental, emotional, and structural that girls, especially girls of color, have to negotiate daily, and that violence for many, particularly the most vulnerable, can have a cascade of consequences that include justice system involvement, child welfare involvement, sort of negative outcomes at school, and so on. Sort of outside of the frame of sort of sexual abuse to prison, I can tell you that we conducted some research recently with youth of color at the Ms. Foundation across the country, and we talked a lot about sort of their organizing, their visions for the future, but we also talked about some of the barriers to realizing those visions. One of the first things that became apparent, though, in the very beginning, was that when we continue to talk about girls as if they are a monolithic group, but they're not. And while they have a great deal of shared experiences, many of the barriers and the struggles that they voiced were directly related to identity and vulnerability. For example, trans binary youth that we spoke with talked about their struggles with housing and economic resources, while many of the system involved youth that we talked with talked about their challenges just negotiating those systems and the ways that they felt powerless to do so, and having few adults outside of the organizations that support them to help them sort of navigate that and be equipped to do it. Youth who were parents talked about the invisibility of their experiences and the ways that we expect them to be adults, like Rebecca mentioned that. Actually, just about all of the youth that we spoke with talked about being at once invisibilized and hyper visible in many ways, criminalized and adultified. And they literally talked about being policed in their various spaces and communities. And this is from the most privileged to the most vulnerable. But at the same time, I will tell you that they're resisting, and that they organize. And this includes the sort of the youth who we don't expect to organize, They do it in ways that are both formal and informal. You're starting to see the organizations coalesce around them and sort of really lift them to leadership, which is why I think we, seen that most of the movements, the sort of uprisings that we've seen recently were youth-led. For us, it's really a joy and a pleasure to be able to sort of resource those movements, because we know at once, they are both the cause and the cure in many ways. So, yeah.
I love the term invisibilized. That is such a powerful word that I feel like I don't often hear, but really captures what's happening in these spaces in schools and in other spaces that girls are in. I want to turn it over to Courtney. Courtney, thank you for your patience. Courtney has done some incredible work in the pro bono capacity, working on cases that have impacted girls and other students in discipline and push out. And so I wanted to turn it over to you to talk about how this has been playing out in some of the cases you've seen.
Yeah, thank you, Sabrina. And thank you everyone else for your remarks, which I think, essentially, I think this is embedded in what everyone has been saying, but it's not just biases that we're dealing with, right? It's not people who are making subjective decisions, but increasingly we see it written into the law, right? And that's where those of us who are lawyers have an ability to play a role to help challenge those laws and those structures, which, perpetuate the biases, which give people within the system subjective decision-making authority, so that those biases can be implemented in ways that have drastic harms to girls' lives. Because, as others have talked about, it is a step towards the prison pipeline. It's a criminalization step, right? Whether you're suspended or there's a police officer in your school who comes to enforce whatever the law is, and just to put it in really practical terms, especially for those of us who have, children or around children, right? We're talking about criminalizing things like being loud or being disruptive, right? Things that kids do and are, right, by their nature. But, as Rebecca explained so well, if you view a girl as older than she is or as less innocent than she is, then suddenly that becomes a basis for discipline and potentially a basis for criminal charges. And I want to pick up on one thing that Nadra mentioned as well about the pandemic, because unfortunately, I think that also contributes to this. I think we've seen all throughout society an increase in sort of antisocial behavior as people return to sort of normal life and go back to school and go back to work. And I think that unfortunately is going to perpetuate some of these biases that already exist within the system and allow people to punish girls and girls of color for reacting to some of those incidents that are going to happen to them. And we often see that, when the law plays out, that, a girl will say she was defending herself and got in trouble for defending herself. And so, my fear is that we're going to see an uptick in that as people sort of get back together in person with these laws in place.
Agreed. I'll toss it over to Rebecca, who has some follow-up on this point.
Yeah, I appreciate your work so much, Courtney. And you mentioned police, and I think that might be one thing that has not been raised yet, that is in itself a barrier and a cause of harm to girls, but absolutely Black girls especially. And that is an issue that girls engage on as well. There is a movement to remove officers from school premises, but it's only been taken up by a handful of jurisdictions, and some of them have slid back to the way that they were before. But when we have officers in schools, as Courtney was alluding to, offenses that used to have you sent to the principal's office suddenly funnel you into the criminal justice system, the juvenile justice system. So our youth advisors put together a town hall last year where we invited school resource officers to participate, and it was a really powerful conversation. And so much so that the National Association of School Resource Officers asked these advisors to present at their annual conference. And I thought that was a testament to how powerful girls' own testimony can be and their answers to some of the problems that they're facing. But that pattern of escalated violence is so strong for Black girls. That's another piece where we feel adultification bias is coming into play. I would just mention as an example, there are unfortunately too many to count. But last year, a 9-year-old girl in Rochester was arrested and put into a squad car in handcuffs when police were called to her house on a domestic disturbance call. She was crying. They requested her to put her feet into the squad car, and she didn't. She was very upset. Remember that her hands were handcuffed right behind her back. She started screaming for her dad, and the police officers threatened to pepper spray her, and she didn't stop screaming. And they told her, "You're acting like a girl." So this was a 9-year-old Black girl. And she had somehow the presence of mind to respond, "I am a child." But the response was to pepper spray her anyway and shut the squad car door, which is a dangerous thing for police to do with adults, and with children even more so, in terms of how pepper spray can affect your respiratory system. But it shows how deep this bias can go if you're yelling at a 9-year-old child and telling her that she's acting like a child.
Absolutely. And to some of our panelists' point about that childlike behavior, right? There have been incidents in the past year of girls who have been arrested or confronted by police because they took too much milk in the cafeteria, or they, I know of one example where a Black girl was failing her virtual ceramics class, and they sent an SRO, a school resource officer, to her home to confront her. And there's the example of the student who goes by the pseudonym Grace, who was sent to a physical detention center for violating her parole towards the beginning of the pandemic for not signing on to school virtual learning, where we know so many children across the country who are experiencing this really unprecedented shift to online learning. We're doing similar things. And so we do see these pop up. And like you said, Rebecca, there are honestly too many to count and to name. But I do want to, segue that into our next question about, how has the pandemic, some folks have already mentioned this, as well as the racial justice reckonings that started to kick up in 2020 have taken root since then. How have these things impacted the issues and barriers girls are facing? And in what ways have you seen these girls overcome these barriers or even flourish in this time? Nadra, I'll kick it off to you to start off with some stories you might have heard during this time, and then we will pass it to some other panelists.
Thank you. Yes, in terms of the racial reckoning of 2020, I've interviewed students who have, started clubs or other sorts of platforms where students in their school districts can speak up about racial injustice, not just nationally or internationally, but also what they're experiencing in class. So whether that's microaggressions or macroaggressions. So I interviewed a student at a school district near San Diego, for example, who started a school district who started a club like that in her school district during that time. So I think that's one way. I think we're also seeing students take issues of racial injustice and then apply them to other forms of injustice. So whether that is, like I mentioned, some of the walkouts that happened because of COVID, students who felt that their schools were not doing enough to keep them safe or to keep their teachers safe. Also, we've seen some teacher strikes during this time in places like Minneapolis and Sacramento. And so there are students who also view that as a racial justice issue. and are supporting teachers and support staff, supporting them getting raises and better benefits. So that's something that's happened more recently, like in the past month. But we're seeing students really getting involved in protesting and organizing in various ways.
That's wonderful. And like our youth advisors mentioned before, having that youth-led effort on these front lines is so important and honestly very inspiring and exciting to see. Shonda, I'll pass it to you. Have you noticed anything that has been happening, or the flourishings that Nadra has started to talk about as well during this time?
Interesting. I think both the pandemic and the backlash from the racial justice reckoning really just exacerbated pre-existing vulnerabilities and disparities. For girls of color and youth of color, this means more caretaking responsibilities, more responsibility to support the home economically. Like Rebecca mentioned early on, it's really, also sort of impacting their mental health and their ability to organize and participate in programming. In fact, one of the youth that we spoke with during our focus groups, when we asked about like participation in protests related to the uprisings, she mentioned that she wasn't able to participate because she was quite literally just trying to stay alive. And that really stuck with me. But when I think about the resilience of youth of color and their ability to flourish and overcome challenges, I sometimes tell a story about my office orchid. And stick with me because it makes sense and tied together. When I started at Men's in November 2019, I bought myself this beautiful white orchid to celebrate. And in March of 2020, the pandemic happened and we started working from home. I didn't return to the office even for just a visit until I think July of that year. But somehow my beautiful orchid, though completely stressed out, did not die. And I've killed enough of these things to know that it should have died because it didn't get water for months, and it actually bloomed even. But as it relates to girls of color, they are still blooming. They're still blooming, but my goodness, they shouldn't have to. So I try to focus more attention on how to get them the supports and the resources that they need than on the question of how they are blooming without it. But that said, some of the most radical, abolitionist organizing that I know of is being led by youth of color, queer youth of color, in fact, through organizations like Assata's Daughter, BYP 100, Project Nia, and Young Women's Freedom Center. Other organizations are responding by reshaping narratives and using art as resistance. Organizations like A Long Walk Home, the Beautiful Project, and so many more.
Thanks so much. And I'm just going to pass it to Rebecca for another remark on this before we move to our next question.
I think it's so critical, Shonda's commentary, that it's not the pandemic that created these problems, but exacerbated problems that were already there. And one of the things that we're looking at is girls' caretaking responsibilities at home, which again, they've always disproportionately shouldered, but during the pandemic, it's really spiked significantly. Girls are asked to do a lot in terms of elder care for their siblings, nieces and nephews, as well as other household tasks, which of course is unpaid, unrecognized, and takes up a lot of their energy. There are benefits to them taking these roles. They have maturity, they have leadership, they have confidence, they're organized, but they also take a toll on girls as well. There's only so many hours in the day, there's only so much energy you can also expend on school. And when schools aren't aware of this, they can exacerbate the harm that's being done to girls by not recognizing what's going on. So we know that girls are late to school because they have to walk their younger sibling to school. And the teachers are responding by thinking they're lazy and they don't care about school. So we really need schools to connect the dots about what girls are experiencing in the pandemic at home that can be affecting them at school. And they can choose to cultivate the leadership qualities that they're seeing. as well, instead of perceiving it as threatening and punishing it.
Thank you for that extra insight, Rebecca. I think it's important too for folks out there who may be working with girls, especially in the education context, to be aware of what can be happening outside of that space and what students are coming into the classroom with, what they're holding, what they're responsible for beyond, homework or anything else that students who are the typical age might be dealing with. With that, I also want to turn to, LGBTQI plus youth and gender justice, of course, includes these youth members. The next question is, what sort of work are youth and their communities doing to protect and advance their rights? What work still needs to be done as we look to the future of gender justice, particularly with the lens towards LGBTQI plus youth? I'm going to pass it to Courtney to maybe talk a little bit about some of the laws we're seeing right now impacting these young people and how this impacts students' civil rights.
Sabrina, and I'm glad that we're talking about this topic as well. I think as Dr. Morris said in her opening remarks, all of these need to go hand in hand. Some of my past work in this area, including with the NWLC, Sabrina, has related to dress codes, which Nadra talked about, and the impact of dress codes, which some of us think of as sort of a relic, but they still exist out there in a lot of places. The impact of dress codes on non-gender conforming youth in particular, also on girls of color in particular, but it does have a distinct impact on non-gender conforming youth because they're often, or at least sometimes, divided by gender, right? So you have to figure out which dress code applies to you, and the school may be making that decision for you in a way that you don't necessarily agree with, and just to think through, the impact of what that means if you're a girl or a boy or a trans student or anyone in a school who's already dealing with, as Rebecca said, middle school pressures and maybe non-conforming in other ways and social issues. And then in addition to have the school impose these guidelines on you that you have to follow, in terms of how you can show up to learn every day. I think the headwinds are clearly out there in this space as well, in terms of state laws that are being enacted, much more directly targeted at this population than we have seen, frankly, in recent years, unfortunately, and in a broader swath of states than we have seen, everything from bathroom laws, which, again, I thought were sort of a thing of the past, but they clearly are not, sports teams, et cetera. So there's plenty of legal work to be done to challenge these laws and the impact of these laws.
Thank you, Courtney. Passing it over to Nadra to highlight maybe some examples of activism relating to these laws that you've seen or heard of in your work.
Yeah, so in some of the places where these laws are being imposed, like Florida, we have seen students holding rallies, speaking out, and unfortunately, some of them have been disciplined and pushed out of school because they have, dared to go public with their gender identities and be critical of the governor of that state and other legislators. But we've also seen some successes. I'm based in Los Angeles, in the third largest school district in California. It's Long Beach Unified School District. They are right now building a new sports facility with gender neutral bathrooms, and we're seeing other places. Chicago announced also earlier this year that they were going to start putting gender neutral signs on bathrooms. And some of the reasons these school districts have decided to do that is because of student activism. And Long Beach students said that there needed to be gender neutral bathrooms. So that's, one area where there has been some success. I would also say, students are involved in clubs like the Gay Straight Alliance, for example, in their schools, and some of them are using those clubs as a way to organize. But in terms of dress codes, especially, I definitely agree. This is an issue. It's affecting girls and boys of color. We've seen Native American boys be punished for having long hair because those, having long hair violates kind of the gender normative dress codes in places like Texas. So we've seen some students file lawsuits against their school districts because of those sorts of laws. The same thing, Black boys with locks is another way that boys are also affected by these dress codes that really exist to enforce, traditional gender norms. So I think these are some of the ways we've seen students, reject these norms and also fight for their rights. I think the other thing would be just discipline in general, because LGBTQIA students are disciplined for violating dress codes. So we have seen some students in that community really get involved in fighting suspensions and expulsions and addressing their school boards. So those are some of the examples I've seen.
I appreciate that, Nadra. Shonda, do you want to chime in there?
One quick point.
Sure.
And I think it's a super important thing to say, and that is for us, gender justice doesn't include justice for LGBTQI A+ youth. Gender justice is justice for LGBTQ youth. In our work, this is an incredibly important distinction because it moves them from the margin to the center in the same ways that our focus on youth of color does by centering the most impacted. And more importantly, I can tell you that the youth themselves are rejecting binaries broadly, gender binaries, binaries around sexuality, more than ever before. In fact, I've seen some polling recently that noted that more youth than ever identify as queer. So I'm really delighted to sort of let them lead around this and to see the ways that manifests in all of our work. And I'll just note that many of the groups that we support right now have had to turn their attention to organizing around the sort of various bills that are impacting trans youth.
Thank you. Rebecca, have you seen anything on this front or have any additional thoughts on what the future of this work can look like as we make sure that we are centering LGBTQI+ youth?
I think the community is doing that for us. You can't ignore this community, and they are twice as politically active as the rest of their Gen Z counterparts, from a study that I read, and that's a pretty powerful statement about how vocal and compelling this group is. And we have a lot of work to do because as we've been mentioning, there are more and more creative and insidious ways that legislators are coming up with to discriminate against this group. And so we all need to be part of the fight against it as allies or just alongside the community.
Absolutely. And that's awesome. I did not know the twice as politically active statistic. That is really cool and really inspiring to hear. Moving to our last question, which is for everyone. Feel free to chime in whenever you're comfortable or if you'd like to chime in. There is a two-part question. One is, how can adults help support, guide, and/or amplify girls' leadership? We had a lot of examples of leadership tonight in our discussion. And how can the generations work together to achieve gender equity? And I will open up the floor to whoever would like to respond first.
I'll jump in first, Sabrina, and I'll answer this again through the lens of being a lawyer, right? And what it is that we can do to help this effort and to help this fight. And it's a broad range of things, right? It ranges from representing individual girls who are caught up in their school disciplinary systems, you know, getting some advice from a lawyer or in the criminal justice system because of what's happened in the school setting or otherwise. Having a lawyer who can, you know, talk to you and advise you on a pro bono basis in many instances can make all the difference between, you know, a terrible outcome and a much more positive outcome in the court system. Unfortunately, that is the way our system operates, that, you know, just the presence of a lawyer can make the difference. I think the other place where I love to contribute effort is by filing amicus briefs in court. So oftentimes it'll be one girl or a small group of girls who, as folks have said on this panel, who really stand up for themselves and file a lawsuit against their school district, or, you know, bring an action to challenge what they believe is wrong. And we think it's important in those cases for the judge who is deciding not just to see that one girl or that group of girls in front of them, but to see how this issue impacts the whole society and impacts girls across the country. And so having an amicus brief that brings the social science that others have done so well, and citing it and describing it and explaining, you know, what is the importance of this issue beyond just the kids who are in front of you, we think can be very powerful and can really help guide the judge to the right outcome. So, I love to do that type of work.
Definitely, I'll +1 that from my standpoint, and appreciate all you researchers out there like Rebecca and related orgs. I am constantly citing reports like that, so 100%.
Okay, I'll jump. Oh, Nadra, you go ahead.
No, you can go.
If you assist. I'll be fast though, because I just wrote a list. First, like I mentioned before, we can recognize that girls aren't monolithic, and it's really critical to adopt an intersectional lens. We can recognize that the self-determination of girls and figure out ways to support their leadership without dominating them. At the same time, we can stop expecting them to have all the answers and create more space and offer them more tools to figure it out. We can be more inclusive around gender. We can think about solutions that are intergenerational, because girls don't exist in and of themselves. They are nested in families, in communities, and the society as a whole. We can create more opportunities for them to just be, to play, to explore, and to be enjoy. And lastly, we can support the work of the folks on this call. We can support organizations that support girls, organizations like the Myth Foundation and Grantmakers for Girls of Color.
And I was just going to say, you know, school officials can really look at their policies and see who's most affected, which groups of students are most affected, whether that's a dress code policy, another discipline sort of policy, testing requirements at their school, etc. If one group is being disproportionately and negatively affected by a certain policy at the school, particularly girls and girls of color, then I think the adults at that school need to reconsider that. And also they need to listen to students. If students are actually speaking out about issues, I've heard time and time again from students that administrators don't take them seriously until they get a lawyer or some sort of advocacy group, or the media gets a hold of the story. And it shouldn't have to get that far. So I would advise, you know, listening to the students in the community.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Nadra. We do have an audience question that has come through. I will read it out loud, and I believe it's related to possibly something Courtney can speak to, but it's possible that other folks can as well. We have one question that has come in. Girls come to me to get more sports programs or equality with men in their sports programs. we have the statute, the regulations, and the case law to help them. I'm guessing we're referring to Title IX. But it's hard to get them to actually sign with a lawyer to remedy the sex discrimination. And even though, it may not take much from the girls themselves. And there's a similar issue with getting girls of color specifically to reach out or make contact with lawyers. And usually in the instances that this audience member has experienced, it's usually highly educated parents who do reach out, if anyone. So does anyone on our panel have tips for how to encourage girls, particularly girls, to reach out, to follow up with attorneys on receiving the relief that they need under the law? And feel free to clarify in the chat if I have mischaracterized the question.
So I'm interested in the other panelists' views on this. I guess I would just acknowledge the hesitancy that exists, and that it's valid and real, and it's based on, probably fear of going public, fear of, being mistreated by the justice system broadly, which is, a fear based in fact, and so it's completely understandable. There are a ton of great organizations that are doing work that, including Sabrina's organization, the National Women's Law Center, the ACLU, and others, who can help connect girls in this situation to legal resources. Sometimes it doesn't involve going public, right? Sometimes all you need is a letter on a lawyer's letterhead in order to get some movement. And so, I think talking through some of those, pre-legal steps can be helpful as well.
I also think this is a place where social media can come into play. I mean, we've seen various forms of #tagism, including around dress codes, around banned books, etc. And so I think getting, if organizations were to engage with girls over social media on those hashtags, which they have, I think that's one way of alerting girls and girls of color in particular that they have that option, because they may not know that they have those rights. Many times they don't know until someone puts them into contact with a lawyer or an advocacy group.
I'll add one quick thing, and that's to just remember that we are all always sort of standing on the shoulders and the work of other people, and that if you are experiencing the thing, there are likely people that are experiencing that thing and have organized around it. So look towards those organizations on the ground that are sort of leading around that work. One that comes to mind is Girls for Gender Equity. I believe Girls for Gender Equity started as Girls for Gender Equity in Sports. So, sort of reach out and sort of touch bases. I can almost assure you that some of those organizations sort of have some effective thoughts, ideas, and strategies that will help you along in your work.
I was going to say something along very similar lines. I would just add the issue of trust, and that girls of color have every reason not to trust the system and perhaps not to trust attorneys. I don't represent girls anymore. I'm a former litigator. But it's really important to establish relationships with women of color in this space who can be that trusted adult. And there are people here in DC. Nancy, thank you for all you've done. I'm so excited to see that you're here. But I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards about people here in DC where I am, who, as Shonda's saying, are already in this space and know girls of color who are affected and might be that person with the relationship who can be part of your work.
Thank you, everyone. And Nancy, I can also highlight one resource that we at the National Women's Law Center offer, which is called the Legal Network for Gender Equity. It is a resource where folks who have experienced discrimination in education, in employment, and in healthcare can reach out to us, and we can connect them to a few attorneys in their area. And these are attorneys that we have vetted and that have some experience in these issues. And if it's a further discussion on how to get that resource out there, happy to do that as well. If you want to send me any contact info in the chat, we can follow up. I appreciate the question. Okay, I think that is all. If we don't have any more audience questions, I'm going to turn us over to our final question. As we all work to support the next generation of gender justice activists, it's essential to check in with them to ensure we're supporting them the way they need. And to that end, we asked additional Georgetown youth advisors to share what they would ask of allies supporting their work.
If you want to advance intersectional gender equity, you must also understand that being gender blind is extremely harmful. Understanding the struggles of one's life due to their identity will allow you to adequately help them. Ignoring who they are is telling them that those struggles do not matter and will force you to treat their situation the same as everyone else's.
We're saying, especially if you are a man and a woman, and if you are a man in a woman's space, listen more than talk and really gather that information and see how you can change. Thank you.
So that is some deeply insightful words from our Georgetown youth advisors. You even hear some of the theme in there of don't invisibilize these students and these young people, kind of relating back to some thoughts that Shonda shared with us. So my final question for the panel is, how do you put this advice into practice in your work? And do you have any advice for others to do so?
Well, for myself, as a reporter, one way I try to advocate for girls, is to actually seek them out and interview them. You would be surprised by, how many publications don't feature students and student voices. So it's important for me to always find the people who are going to be directly affected by a certain policy or by a certain law. So in cases of education, if that's students and if that's girls and girls of color in particular, then I would seek those, girls out, which, that might sometimes take more work, but I think it's important to center them in my reporting.
I'm gonna +1 that. I think I'm gonna +10 that. Yeah, I think Rebecca listed this earlier. So just by making sure that we're always including the voices and the leadership of young folks. One thing I also like to do is to make sure that we are compensating them appropriately, and that they can expect to be. If we're saying that we consider them experts, then we need to pay them like experts. And they need to expect to sort of be compensated for their time. I think my personal orientation to the work is to always give more than I take, and to open some doors that might be closed. I think lastly, moving the resources to them such that they can do the work that they need from the most equipped place.
I love it, Shonda. Yes, we need to equitably compensate young people for their time. Any other thoughts or advice or tips about the work you do?
I think it's been addressed. So at risk of repeating what others have said, adults need to step aside and listen.
Right.
And give the support that they can through the skill sets that they have and the more obvious kinds of power that adults have. But to be humble in acknowledging that girls have so much power in and of themselves, and they can rise to the occasion if you provide opportunities to lead. Mentorship is also very helpful in terms of what we can do as adults.
And I can't say it any better than my fellow panelists have.
Thanks so much. And thank you all for your thoughts, insights, advice, in combination with our youth advisors. And from there, I will turn it over to Abby.
Thank you all so much for being here tonight, to all of our panelists, to our youth advisors for opening us up and sharing their voices at the beginning and end of our program. And of course, to our co-hosts, the Ms. Foundation for Women and the Georgetown Law Initiative on Gender Justice and Opportunity. This has been such a wonderful conversation, and we're so grateful to have you all here tonight. Thank you to our audience for joining us. And I'd also like to extend special thanks to the Ms. Foundation's Ruth McFarlane and Stephanie Blackwood for their partnership throughout this series. It's been a real pleasure to work with you. So we hope everyone on this call and everyone who is listening on the recording in the future will sign up for all of our wonderful organizations' mailing lists to learn how to help fight all of these wonderful battles alongside our youth and help elevate the next generation of gender justice. So thank you again and have a wonderful evening. Take care, everyone.